Do not eat. The feast is poisoned. Lucius knows. Those 7 words, scratched in trembling ink on a slip of parchment no larger than a prayer card, did what no army had accomplished in 3 centuries. They made Aurelian Nightborn feel cold. Not in his flesh, which had forgotten warmth long ago, but in his blood, which suddenly remembered what fear tastes like. For a vampire king who had survived coups, wars, and the slow entropy of ages, this was different. This wasn't politics. This was personal, and it was about to tear apart the one thing he had spent lifetimes building: trust. Before we dive into the shadows of the Obsidian Court, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Are you in New York? London? Tokyo? Maybe somewhere I've never heard of? I love seeing where my story family connects from across the globe. And trust me, you'll want to be subscribed because tomorrow's story is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. Now, let's step into a world where a single note can topple an empire. Aurelian hadn't come to the Obsidian Court's grand feast expecting trouble. He came to reaffirm dominance, to watch his noble houses kneel and renew their blood oaths, to let the weight of ritual remind everyone why his reign had outlasted empires. He wore the ceremonial black and crimson, sat beneath stained glass that filtered moonlight into blood-red patterns, and prepared to perform the oldest role he knew: the untouchable king. But from the moment the first course was announced, something felt wrong. The timing was off. The steward's movements were too practiced. The silence in the hall was too careful, like everyone was holding their breath for something they weren't supposed to know about. And then Seraphina Crow placed the silver cloche before him. She didn't ask for help. She didn't beg. She just slipped the note beneath the dome with a movement so practiced it looked like an accident, her fingers steady even as her pulse hammered loud enough for him to hear it across the table. Her eyes met his for half a heartbeat, quiet, terrified, resolved, and then she was gone, disappearing back into the anonymity of service. That note cracked the mask off everything. This isn't just a story about assassination. It's about the illusion of control, about what happens when the person holding all the power realizes they've been blind to the knife being sharpened in their own kitchen. It's about the hidden betrayals that fester in places of privilege, and how sometimes the smallest voice carries the only warning that matters. This is a vampire story, but it's also a human one. And if you've ever wondered how even the most powerful can fall, this is how it begins. Not with a roar, but with a folded note passed across a table. Aurelian Nightborn was a king who had turned patience into an art form. At an age that no longer mattered, centuries old, maybe more, he had become the undisputed ruler of the vampire world. Not through brutality, though he was capable of it. Not through fear alone, though he commanded plenty. He ruled through inevitability. He was the gravity that bent every other force in the room toward him. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply existed, and the world rearranged itself accordingly. But even gravity couldn't prepare him for the note Seraphina had slipped beneath his cloche. Long before that night, Aurelian had learned the cost of trust. Raised in an era when bloodlines meant everything and loyalty was currency, he had watched allies turn to ash, advisors scheme in shadows, lovers attempt assassination disguised as seduction. He had survived not because he was stronger than his enemies, though he was, but because he had learned to read the spaces between words, the hesitations before answers, the way someone's heartbeat changed when they lied. On paper, he was the Obsidian King, ruler of the ancient court, commander of 12 noble vampire houses, and keeper of rituals older than most nations. He lived in a fortress carved from black stone and polished with centuries of blood oaths. He wore crowns forged in alchemical fire. He dined beneath chandeliers that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But behind the ritual and finery, he was still the boy who had clawed his way out of a tomb his own sire had sealed, the young vampire who had learned that immortality didn't mean safety, it just meant you had more time to be betrayed. He didn't wear excessive jewelry. No gaudy rings or ornamental nonsense. Aurelian understood how quickly people judged power by appearances before they ever felt its true weight. So when whispers began circulating through the court, subtle enough to be dismissed, persistent enough to matter, he didn't send spies or summon inquisitors. He convened a feast, the oldest, most sacred ritual in vampire tradition. A ceremony so steeped in protocol that any deviation would be noticed. A test disguised as celebration. No one suspected he was watching. And that was exactly the point. Sometimes, to see betrayal, you have to let it think it's invisible. That's what Aurelian had learned. He wasn't just a king. He was a mirror held up to his own court. And tonight, he wanted to see what that mirror would reflect. Raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. Because real power isn't about being feared. It's about knowing what everyone else is too afraid to see. The Obsidian Court was the kind of place that made even immortals lower their voices. Built into the hollowed-out heart of an ancient mountain, its walls were black volcanic glass that reflected candlelight like frozen smoke. Stained glass windows, each one depicting a different era of vampire conquest, cast fractured colors across marble floors polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air smelled of old wine, burning wax, and something old, something like memory. You didn't come to the Obsidian Court just to dine. You came to be judged, to prove your worth, to remind yourself that hierarchy was real and... The grand dining hall stretched longer than a cathedral, lined with columns carved to look like petrified trees. At the far end, beneath a dome painted with constellations that no longer existed in the night sky, sat the high table. Aurelian's throne was more suggestion than furniture, carved from a single piece of obsidian, draped in crimson velvet, positioned so that moonlight always fell across it first. The hall was filled tonight. 12 noble houses, each represented by their eldest and most cunning. They wore silk and brocade, jewelry that clinked softly like chains, smiles that promised loyalty until the moment it became inconvenient. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every toast is calculated. The Obsidian Court didn't tolerate spontaneity. From the moment Aurelian took his seat, the ritual began. Servants moved like shadows, silent, efficient, unseen unless needed. The steward, Lucius Varick, stood at attention near the kitchen entrance, his silver hair slicked back, his expression professionally neutral. He had served the court for over 2 centuries, longer than some of the nobles had been undead. His efficiency was legendary. His loyalty, unquestioned. Until tonight. The first course was announced. Wine from vines grown in consecrated soil, bread baked with herbs that only bloomed under moonlight. Symbolic. Ancient. Harmless. Except Aurelian noticed the steward's hands when he signaled the servers. A slight tremor. A hesitation that lasted less than a second. And the way the kitchen doors opened, half a beat too quickly, as if someone inside had been waiting, listening. The Obsidian Court wasn't broken. It was performing exactly as designed. A place where power was theater, where tradition masked intention, where everyone smiled and no one blinked. But Aurelian, seated in his throne of black glass, saw it for what it truly was, not a court, a stage. And tonight, someone had rewritten the script without telling him. Seraphina Crow moved through the Obsidian Court like she had been born to disappear. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet discipline of someone who had learned early that survival meant staying unnoticed. She wasn't meek. There was steel in her spine, but she had mastered the art of making herself small, of moving between shadows, of being present without being seen. She hadn't always been a servant. Once, she had been a scholar's daughter in a village that no longer existed, a girl who memorized stories and dreamed of writing her own. She had wanted to study history, to teach, to matter. But when her father spoke too openly about the noble house's corruption, when he published pamphlets questioning blood oaths and ancient rituals, the Obsidian Court's justice was swift and absolute. Her family was erased. Not killed. That would have been mercy. Erased. Titles revoked. Properties seized. Memories of them scrubbed from official records. Seraphina survived only because she had been away when the enforcers came, studying at a distant library. By the time she returned, her home was ash and her name was poison. So she became no one. She took work where she could find it, kitchens, stables, eventually the obsidian court itself. Because sometimes the safest place to hide is in the shadows of the thing that destroyed you. No one looked twice at servants. No one asked questions. She tied her dark hair back, wore the plain blue uniform, and learned to move between tables without disturbing the air. But invisibility has advantages. Servants hear everything. They stand in corners during private conversations. They refill wine while nobles discuss treason. They carry messages, witness bribes, and see the moments when masks slip. Serafina had seen Lucius Varick in the kitchens 3 nights in a row. Unusual, invasive, wrong. She had watched him alter the ceremonial menu, redirecting courses, changing sigils on the preparation orders. She had overheard fragments. The king won't suspect, and it has to be the main course, and we'll never get this chance again. At first, she told herself it wasn't her concern. She had survived this long by keeping her head down. But then she saw the chef, Balthazar Reed, with his hands shaking as he prepared a dish that made the air in the kitchen taste like copper and rot. She saw the fear in his eyes, the resignation, and she realized, if she did nothing, she would be complicit in murder. Writing the note took her an hour. Her hands shook so badly she had to rewrite it twice. She folded it small enough to hide beneath a serving cloche, practiced the motion until it looked accidental, and prayed to gods she no longer believed in that the king would understand. She didn't expect gratitude. She didn't even expect to survive the night. She just wanted to do one thing, one true thing, before the obsidian court swallowed her whole. But to understand why Serafina's warning mattered, you have to understand Aurelian Nightborn, not the king crowned in ritual and draped in centuries of blood oaths, but the vampire who had learned, through betrayal after betrayal, that power without vigilance is just a prettier word for blindness. This is how he built his empire. And this is how, in one silent moment, it almost fell. Aurelian had survived 3 centuries by mastering a single principle: never be the first to taste anything, not wine, not loyalty, not trust. The note burned in his palm like silver, tucked now inside his sleeve, where no one could see it. His face remained carved in polished indifference, the expression he had worn through wars, coronations, and the slow deaths of everyone he had ever loved. Around him, the feast continued its choreographed procession. Crystal clinked. Servants glided. Nobles smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes. But Aurelian was elsewhere, sifting through centuries of memory for the pattern he knew was there. He had been betrayed before. The first time was in 1847 by a lover who poisoned his wine with the essence of white oak and vervain, a cocktail that would have reduced him to ash if he hadn't noticed the way her pulse quickened when she poured. He killed her slowly, not from cruelty, but from necessity. Mercy, he learned early, was a luxury that got you buried. The second time was in 1923 by his own blood child, who believed patricide was a valid path to succession. Aurelian had suspected for months, noticed the way alliances shifted in his absence, the whispered conversations that died when he entered rooms. When the coup finally came, he was ready. He didn't just survive. He turned the betrayer's own strategy against him, forced him to watch as every co-conspirator was executed, then sealed him in a tomb where time moves differently. Immortality, Aurelian demonstrated, could be a punishment far worse than death. But this felt different. This wasn't ambition. This was precision. Surgical. Calculated. Someone had studied him long enough to know his rituals, his weaknesses, his blind spots. Someone close enough to weaponize the ceremony itself. His eyes drifted to Lucius Varick. The head steward stood near the obsidian pillars, his posture textbook perfect, his silver hair catching candlelight like frost. Lucius had served the obsidian court for 247 years. He had been there when Aurelian claimed the throne, had organized every feast, every blood oath renewal, every ritual binding since. His efficiency was legendary, the kind of servant who anticipated needs before they were spoken, who made power look effortless because he managed every detail behind the scenes. Lucius knows. The words echoed in Aurelian's mind like a curse. Could it be? Could the man who had knelt at his coronation, who had sworn oaths renewed in blood every decade, who had stood at his right hand through insurrections and sieges, could that man be the architect of his death? Aurelian's gaze swept the high table. 12 noble houses, each represented by their most dangerous. Lady Morrigan of House Thornwick, whose smile never reached her eyes. Lord Cale of House Silverin, who had coveted the throne since the day he'd been turned. Baroness Vesper of House Nightshade, whose family had ruled before Aurelian and never quite forgiven the usurpation. Any of them would kill him if they thought they could survive the attempt. But none of them could have orchestrated this alone. The feast was too sacred, too protected by ritual and blood magic. Tampering with it required knowledge of old ceremonies, access to restricted kitchens, and the ability to move through the court's defenses like a ghost. It required someone like Lucius. The second course arrived, venison prepared in wine reduction, garnished with herbs grown in moonlight. The ritual dictated that Aurelian taste first, signaling to the court that the offering was accepted. His hand moved toward the fork. He stopped. Not because of fear. Fear was a mortal indulgence he had abandoned centuries ago. But because he noticed the way Lord Cale's fingers tightened around his goblet. The way Lady Morgan's eyes flicked toward the kitchen doors. The way Baroness Vesper's breathing slowed, as if she were bracing for something. They were waiting, watching, expecting. Aurelian smiled and set down his fork. A toast first, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. To tradition, to blood, to the bonds that hold us when steel cannot. The court rose as one, goblets lifted. They drank. Aurelian did not. He raised his glass to his lips, tilted it, but never swallowed. An old trick, one that had saved him before. He watched their faces, over the rim of crystal. Disappointment flickered across Lord Cale's expression, there and gone in a heartbeat. Lady Morrigan's smile tightened. Baroness Vesper looked down at her plate too quickly, as if avoiding something she couldn't bear to see. They knew. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough. Aurelian's mind raced through possibilities. The feast served multiple purposes. Political theater, yes, but also a binding ritual. Blood oaths were renewed during these ceremonies, magical contracts that tied the noble houses to his rule. If he died here, during the ritual, before the oaths were sealed, the contracts would dissolve. The court would fracture. Civil war would erupt before his body went cold. Someone wanted chaos. Someone wanted the Obsidian Court to tear itself apart. But who benefited from that? Not the nobles. They needed stability, hierarchy, the structure that kept lesser vampires from challenging their own positions. Unless they'd been promised something. Protection. Power. A new order. He filed the thought away, his expression never changing. The third course arrived, and with it, Lucius approached. The steward moved with practiced grace, bending close enough to whisper. Your Majesty, the chef inquired whether the venison was to your satisfaction. He wishes to adjust the final preparation accordingly. Too solicitous. Too concerned. Lucius had served him for centuries and never once asked about food preferences mid-feast. Aurelian met his eyes, gray, steady, unreadable. Tell Balthazar his work is, as always, impeccable. I look forward to the main course with great anticipation. He watched for the tell, the micro-expression, the slight dilation of pupils or quickening of breath that would confirm what the note suggested. Lucius's face remained smooth as marble. Of course, Your Majesty. He will be honored. But his hands, his perfectly controlled, centuries-trained hands, trembled for exactly 1 second before he clasped them behind his back. There. Aurelian smiled, the expression cold as a tomb. I've always appreciated your dedication, Lucius. The court would crumble without you. You're too kind, Majesty. Lucius bowed. Everything I do is in service to your eternal reign. Eternal. The word hung in the air like smoke. As Lucius retreated, Aurelian's mind crystallized around a single certainty. Someone in this room had prepared an end for him. They had corrupted his rituals, weaponized his traditions, and turned the very mechanisms of his power into a trap. And they had done it with surgical precision, the kind that only came from intimate knowledge. He would not stop the feast. He would not flee or show weakness. Instead, he would do what he had always done. Turn their strategy into his weapon. Let them think the poison would land. Let them believe their plan was unfolding perfectly. Then, when they exhaled in triumph, he would show them what 3 centuries of rule had taught him. Power isn't about strength. It's about who stops breathing first. Seraphina stood in the shadows behind the obsidian pillars, her hands clasped to her waist, her breathing shallow and controlled. From here, she could see the high table without being seen, a skill she had perfected over 3 years of service. The ability to be present and absent simultaneously. To exist in the negative space between noticing and noticing. It was a survival skill she had learned the hard way. The night her father was erased, Seraphina had been 17 and foolish enough to believe truth mattered more than power. She had watched from a hidden alcove as enforcers burned her family's research, seized their property, and struck their name from every record in the district. Her father had been a historian who made the mistake of asking dangerous questions. Why did the blood oaths bind only one direction? Why were servant deaths never investigated? Why did the noble houses fear transparency more than insurrection? The Obsidian Court's answer came in fire and silence. Seraphina survived by becoming what her family had studied, invisible, expendable, beneath notice. She took her mother's maiden name, scrubbed her past clean, and learned that servants weren't people to the nobility. They were furniture that occasionally moved, and furniture heard everything. It started 3 nights ago, in the kitchens after the evening meal service. Seraphina had been returning empty decanters when she heard Lucius Varick's voice. Clipped, urgent, wrong. The head steward never came to the kitchens. That was beneath his station, a violation of the careful hierarchy that governed court life. But there he was, standing beside the central preparation table, his silver hair catching lamplight as he spoke to someone in the shadows. Seraphina pressed herself against the stone archway, barely breathing. The timing must be exact, Lucia said. During the 3rd course, before the blood oaths are renewed. The ritual protects him, but only after the binding is complete. A pause. Then another voice, rough and strained. This will kill me too. You know that. Your lineage is already forfeit, Balthazar. This way, at least your death serves a purpose. Seraphina's blood went cold. She knew that second voice, Balthazar Reed, the head chef. A man who moved through the kitchens like an artist, who treated food with reverence, who had once shown her kindness when she'd burned herself on a copper pot. He was many things, but he wasn't a conspirator, which meant he was being coerced. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning she watched. She noticed things servants were trained not to see. Lucius returning to the kitchens twice more, always after the main staff had left. The way preparation orders were rewritten in different ink. How certain ingredients, ones she'd never seen before, appeared in locked cabinets that only Lucius could access. And the sigils. The magical marks pressed into serving dishes to preserve heat and freshness. Someone had altered them. The modifications were subtle, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. But Seraphina's father had taught her the old languages before he was erased. She recognized corruption when she saw it. These weren't preservation marks anymore. They were concealment runes. On the 2nd night, she followed Balthazar into the cold storage. The chef's hands shook as he measured something from a crystal vial, a liquid that looked like oil but moved like smoke. He muttered under his breath, and Seraphina caught fragments. Forgive me, no choice. They'll slaughter everyone. She understood then. This wasn't ambition. This was extortion. Balthazar was being forced to create something that violated every principle he held sacred. He was weaponizing his own art, and it was destroying him. The 3rd night, she heard Lucius say the words that confirmed everything. The king will never suspect his own feast. He's ruled too long. Grown complacent. This is mercy, really, ending it before he becomes the tyrant his predecessor was. Mercy. They were calling murder mercy. Serafina's hands clenched. She thought of her father, who had died asking questions. Of her mother, who had withered from grief. Of every servant who had disappeared after witnessing something inconvenient, their bodies never found, their names never spoken. She thought of doing nothing, of surviving, of keeping her head down and letting history repeat itself, because that's what the powerless did. They endured. Then she thought of Balthazar's shaking hands, of Aurelian Nightborn, who might be a tyrant or might be the only thing holding this court together, of the civil war that would erupt if the king died during a ritual feast, the chaos that would devour servants first and nobles last. Fear lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. But it wasn't fear of death. She had made peace with that the night her family burned. It was fear of complicity. Fear that silence would make her just another part of the machine that ground innocence to dust. So she wrote the note. Her hands shook so badly the first attempt was illegible. The second was barely better. 7 words that could end her life if anyone found them. Do not eat. The feast is poisoned. Lucius knows. She folded the parchment until it was smaller than a coin, practiced slipping it under a cloche 30 times until the motion looked accidental, and prayed to gods she no longer trusted that the vampire king was as perceptive as the legends claimed. Now, standing in the shadows, watching Aurelian at the high table, she waited. He hadn't eaten. He had raised his goblet but not drunk. His expression remained carved in ancient stone, but his eyes moved differently now. Sharper. Hunting. He knew, or at least he suspected. Serafina exhaled slowly, her knees weak with relief and terror in equal measure. She had done the only thing she could. Spoken truth to power in the only voice available to her, a whisper on paper. Whether it would save him or condemn them both, she would know soon enough. The feast continued. The court smiled. And in the shadows, a waitress who should have been invisible watched an immortal king decide whether to believe a mortal's warning. Hold on, before we see what happens next, I need to know, are you Team Serafina or Team Aurelian? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're watching from places like Los Angeles, Mumbai, or Sao Paulo, give me a shout out. I'm building a global story community here, and your city might just inspire my next tale. Hit that like button if you're on the edge of your seat right now, because what's coming next will leave you breathless. Now, back to the feast where everything is about to explode. Balthazar Reed's hands had not stopped shaking for 3 days. In the kitchen, his kitchen, the sanctuary he had built over 60 years of service, he stood over a copper pot that contained enough poison to kill a creature that should not be able to die. The liquid inside shimmered like oil on water, colors shifting from black to green to something that had no name in any language he knew. It smelled of copper and rot and broken oaths. He had prepared it perfectly, because that's what Lucius had demanded, and because Balthazar's entire bloodline would be slaughtered if he didn't. The blood-binding curse wasn't visible, those never were, but Balthazar felt it like iron weights chained to his chest, tightening with every breath. Lucius had invoked an oath so ancient most vampires had forgotten it existed, the covenant of ash and bone, a ritual that bound a servant's life not just to their own actions, but to their entire family line, children, grandchildren, cousins, everyone who shared even a drop of red blood. 147 people. That's how many would die screaming if Balthazar refused or failed. Lucius had recited their names. All of them, in alphabetical order, while pressing a ceremonial blade against Balthazar's throat. I need your artistry, the steward had whispered, his breath cold against Balthazar's ear. This poison must be undetectable until it's too late. It must survive the preservation of sigils, pass through the ritual protections, and deliver death disguised as a feast. Only you have the skill. Balthazar had wanted to refuse, had wanted to drive a kitchen knife through Lucius's heart and damn the consequences. But then he thought of his daughter Margot, who was teaching in the outer provinces, of his grandson Thomas, barely 6 years old, of his sister Elena, who had already lost one son to the court's casual cruelty. So he nodded, and he began to cook death. The poison was called Noctis Eternal, a compound so rare it appeared in only 3 texts, all of them locked in the court's forbidden archives. It required 13 ingredients, including the rendered essence of white oak, distilled moonlight harvested during an eclipse, and the ground bone of a vampire who had died by their own hand. Each component had to be prepared in precise sequence, under specific lunar conditions, with rituals spoken in a language that predated the obsidian court itself. Balthazar was a master of his craft. He followed the instructions exactly, except for one modification. A change so subtle that even Lucius, who watched him like a hawk, didn't notice. He reduced the concentration by 30%. It wouldn't save Aurelian. Noctis Eternal would still kill him. But it might buy time. Might allow the king to recognize the symptoms before the poison completed its work. Might give him a chance to do what Balthazar couldn't. Fight back. It was a desperate gamble. A cook's rebellion, measured in drops and ratios instead of swords and declarations. Now, as he ladled the final preparation into the ornate serving dishes, Balthazar felt the weight of what he had become. Not a chef, not an artist, a weapon. His kitchens, the place where he had created beauty and nourishment for decades, had been transformed into an execution chamber. The servers lined up to carry the dishes to the high table. Serafina was among them, her face pale but composed. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Balthazar saw something there that made his breath catch. Knowledge. She knew. Somehow, that quiet girl who moved through the kitchens like a ghost had pieced together what was happening. Had she done something? Said something? He couldn't ask. Couldn't risk drawing attention. So he simply nodded, a gesture so small it might have been nothing, or might have been everything. The doors to the great hall swung open. The servers processed forward, carrying silver cloches that concealed death dressed in garnish and reduction sauce. Balthazar followed at a distance as protocol demanded. The head chef always observed the high table's reaction to the main course. It was tradition. But this time, he wasn't watching to gauge satisfaction. He was watching for signs that the king understood the danger. Through the doorway, Balthazar could see Aurelian Nightborn seated beneath stained glass that painted him in blood-colored light. The vampire king's expression was carved marble, revealing nothing. But his posture, there was something different about it. Attention, an awareness. Their eyes met across the hall. In that instant, Balthazar tried to communicate everything he couldn't say aloud. I'm sorry. I had no choice. I tried to weaken it. Please, if you survive this, remember that some of us were slaves, not traitors. Aurelian's gaze held his for one heartbeat longer than necessary. Then the king's eyes shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward Lucius Varick. He knew, or suspected. The note, if Serafina had managed to pass the note, had found its mark. Balthazar's chest tightened with something between hope and terror. If Aurelian survived, perhaps the blood binding could be broken. Perhaps Balthazar's family would be spared. But if the king died anyway, Lucius would know someone had interfered. And the steward's vengeance would be thorough. The servers reached the high table. Cloches were lifted with synchronized precision. Steam rose, carrying the aroma of rosemary and thyme, and underneath it, too faint for anyone but Balthazar to detect, the bitter tang of something that should never touch a tongue. Aurelian stared at the dish before him. His hand moved toward the fork, then paused. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Balthazar's hands clenched at his sides. The kitchen behind him felt like a graveyard now. All those copper pots and hanging herbs, all those years of honest work, poisoned by a single act of coerced betrayal. He had spent his life believing that food was sacred. That to feed someone was an act of love, of care, of basic human dignity. Now he understood a darker truth. The kitchen wasn't separate from the battlefield. It had always been part of it. Food was just another weapon, and cooks were just soldiers who wore aprons instead of armor. The poison dish sat on the high table, waiting. And in the doorway between kitchen and court, Balthazar Reed, artist, father, unwilling assassin, waited too. Lucius Verric had served kings for 247 years, and he had learned that immortality was the greatest curse ever inflicted upon governance. From his position near the obsidian pillars, he watched Aurelian Nightborn hesitate over the poison dish and felt a familiar contempt coil in his chest. The king who never ages. The ruler who never dies. The tyrant who mistakes longevity for wisdom. Lucius had been 19 when he was turned, a servant boy chosen for his efficiency and silence. He had believed then that serving the obsidian court was an honor, that proximity to power was its own reward. He had organized feasts, managed blood oaths, perfected the machinery of ritual until it ran like clockwork. And for what? To watch the same king sit on the same throne for 3 centuries while the world outside transformed beyond recognition? To witness stagnation dressed in ceremony, calling itself tradition? No. This wasn't murder. This was evolution. Aurelian had ruled too long. His existence had calcified the court into something rigid and brittle. The noble houses feared him too much to innovate, respected him too much to challenge, needed him too much to imagine alternatives. He had become less a king and more a gravitational constant, inescapable, unchanging, crushing everything into orbit around his will. Immortality bred tyranny. Lucius understood this in a way Aurelian never could. The king thought his longevity proved his right to rule, but all it proved was that he couldn't be removed by natural means. So Lucius had spent 5 years planning an unnatural one. The poison was brilliant. Even he had to admit that. Noctis Eternal existed in only 3 texts, required ingredients that took years to acquire, and demanded preparation rituals so complex that only a master like Balthazar could execute them. It was undetectable by conventional means, invisible to magical wards, and designed to mimic natural death, if such a thing existed for vampires. Aurelian would simply stop. His heart, which barely beat anyway, would forget its rhythm. His consciousness would dissolve like ink in water. There would be no thrashing, no screaming, no dramatic final words. He would sit at the high table, fork in hand, and fade into the nothing he had been avoiding for 300 years. And then the court would fracture. Lucius had accounted for this. Had spent decades cultivating relationships with the noble houses, planting seeds of discontent, promising them autonomy once the Eternal King was gone. Lady Morgan wanted control of the Eastern Territories. Lord Cale coveted the ancient libraries. Baroness Vesper simply wanted to prove her house could rule again. They would fight, of course. Civil war was inevitable. But from chaos came opportunity. And Lucius, patient, efficient, indispensable Lucius, would be the one they turned to for order. He knew every ritual, every protocol, every blood oath binding. He was the institutional memory of the court. They would need him, and he would reshape the obsidian court into something flexible, something that could adapt and evolve instead of fossilizing under one man's eternal reign. This was righteousness. This was a necessity. But watching Aurelian now, Lucius felt the first thread of irritation pull tight in his chest. The king should have eaten by now. Protocol dictated the first bite be taken immediately after the dishes were presented. Yet Aurelian sat motionless, his fork hovering, his expression infuriatingly calm. Why wasn't he eating? Lucius replayed the evening in his mind. Every detail had been perfect. The timing, the preparation, the ritual sequence. Balthazar had followed instructions exactly. Lucius had watched him personally. The poison was in the dish. The wards were altered. The noble houses were positioned correctly to witness the king's death during the ceremony. Everything was aligned. So, why did Aurelian's hand remain frozen? Across the hall, Lucius noticed Seraphina Crow standing in the shadows. The waitress. Barely worth noticing, except she had been the one to serve Aurelian's table. Had placed the cloche. Had moved with that practiced invisibility servants perfected. A cold suspicion flickered. But no. Servants didn't interfere. They existed in the margins, too afraid and too insignificant to matter. That was the foundation of the entire system, the hierarchy that kept everything functioning. Still, the hesitation bothered him. Lucius made a subtle gesture to one of the serving staff, a prearranged signal. The woman nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, the steward of wines approached the high table. "Your Majesty," the man said smoothly, "shall we proceed to the ceremonial toast before the main course? The vintage has been breathing, and Chef Reed is anxious that the dish be consumed at optimal temperature." Accelerating the ritual. Forcing the moment. It was a minor deviation, but within acceptable parameters. Lucius watched Aurelian's reaction carefully. The king glanced at the wine steward, then at his untouched plate. Something passed across his face, too quick to read, but present nonetheless. Then he smiled, that infuriating marble smile, and lifted his goblet. Of course, tradition must be observed. The court rose as one. Goblets raised. The ritual toast began, words in an ancient dialect that bound the noble houses to their oaths. Lucius recited along with them, his voice steady, his mind racing through contingencies. Once the toast concluded, Aurelian would have to eat. Protocol demanded it. The blood oaths couldn't be sealed until the king consumed the ceremonial meal. Every vampire in the hall knew this. To refuse would be an insult to the houses, a suggestion that the offerings were unworthy. Aurelian would eat. He had no choice. The toast ended. Goblets lowered. The hall fell silent with expectation. Aurelian set down his wine and reached for his fork. Lucius felt something unfamiliar surge through him, not quite triumph, but close. The moment he had architected across 5 years of careful planning was finally, inevitably arriving. The fork touched the food. The king began to lift it toward his mouth. In seconds, the oldest reign in the Obsidian Court's history would end. And Lucius Varick, the servant who had been overlooked and underestimated for 2 centuries, would become the architect of a new era. He allowed himself the smallest smile. Just a slight adjustment of lips, invisible to everyone but himself. The pieces were in motion. The board was set. And kings, no matter how ancient, eventually fell. It was simply a matter of time. Aurelian's fork paused inches from his mouth. Then, with deliberate grace, he set it down and touched his right temple with 2 fingers, a gesture so subtle it might have been adjusting a strand of hair. In the kitchen doorway, Balthazar Reed went perfectly still. The sign was 3 centuries old, originating from a time when kitchen staff and nobility communicated through silent codes during sieges. 2 fingers to the temple meant, "I see the trap. Proceed with secondary protocol." Balthazar's heart hammered. The king knew, and he was giving Balthazar permission to act. The chef turned smoothly, as if simply checking on his staff, and made his own signal. A hand pressed briefly to his chest, then extended outward. To the trained eye, it looked like a casual stretch. To the 3 senior kitchen staff who understood the old codes, it meant, redirect. Now. The ballet began. A server carrying replacement dishes emerged from the kitchen, meals prepared simultaneously, identical in appearance, but clean of poison. Another server stumbled deliberately near the high table, creating a moment of distraction. In the chaos of apologies and shuffling servers, dishes were swapped with movements so practiced they seemed accidental. The poison plate that had sat before Aurelian vanished, replaced by one that would only nourish. The deadly meals meant for the inner circle were rerouted to serving carts marked for disposal. It took 17 seconds. No one in the court noticed anything except a minor disruption quickly corrected. Except Lucius. The steward's eyes narrowed as he watched the servants reorganize. His gaze tracked each movement, calculating, searching for deviation from protocol. But the kitchen staff moved with their usual efficiency. Nothing appeared wrong. Yet something felt wrong, a sensation like silk pulled slightly off grain. He couldn't identify it, and that ignorance gnawed at him. Aurelian lifted his fork again and took the first bite. His expression revealed nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just the mild acknowledgement of a meal adequately prepared. The court relaxed, the tension breaking like a held breath finally released. The ritual continued. Dishes were consumed. Wine was poured. The noble houses ate what they believed was a ceremonial feast, never knowing they had been moments away from consuming poison meant for their king. Lady Morgan laughed at something Lord Cale said. Baroness Vesper complimented the wine. The hall filled with the sounds of silver on porcelain, of conversation carefully calibrated to sound casual while advancing political agendas. But beneath the surface, a different battle raged. Lucius watched Aurelian with predatory focus. The king should be dying. The poison worked quickly. Symptoms began within minutes. Disorientation first, then a weakening of motor control, finally the complete shutdown of consciousness. Yet Aurelian sat upright, conversing with the nobles, his movements precise and controlled. Had Balthazar failed? Reduced the dosage? The chef had seemed compliant, terrified of the blood-binding curse. But perhaps fear made men reckless rather than obedient. Or a worse thought crystallized. Had someone warned the king? Lucius's gaze swept the hall, landing on Seraphina Crowe. She stood in her designated position, hands clasped, face composed. But there was something different about her posture, a tension that looked like relief. As if she had been bracing for catastrophe, and it hadn't come. The waitress, the invisible, insignificant waitress who served the high table. His greatest miscalculation stared at him from across the hall, wearing a servant's uniform and a carefully blank expression. Lucius felt rage simmer beneath his composed exterior. He had accounted for nobles, for guards, for magical wards. But he had forgotten the first rule of palace intrigue. Servants were everywhere, and invisibility made them dangerous. Still, the ritual wasn't complete. There were more courses, more opportunities. He could adapt, salvage this. But even as the thought formed, he noticed Aurelian's eyes on him. Cool, assessing, aware. The king knew, not just about the poison, but about who had orchestrated it. And he was simply waiting. The realization hit Lucius like cold iron. He wasn't a hunter anymore. Somewhere between the first course and now, the roles had reversed. He had become prey being studied by something ancient and patient. Aurelian took another bite, chewed slowly, and smiled at Lord Cale's attempted joke. Every gesture radiated control. Nothing in his demeanor suggested urgency or fear. He was a king at feast, performing his role with the ease of 3 centuries' practice. But Lucius could see it now. The minute shifts in posture, the way Aurelian's attention tracked certain individuals, the slight signals passed between king and chef. This wasn't ignorance. This was a theater. The 4th course arrived. The 5th. Each one consumed without incident. Each moment that passed without the king's death was another nail in Lucius's carefully constructed plan. He couldn't stop now. Couldn't abort. The ritual demanded completion, and interrupting it would raise suspicions he couldn't afford. So he stood in his position, maintaining the mask of loyal steward, while watching his 5 years of planning unravel in real time. Seraphina remained in the shadows, her fear transformed into something harder. She had done what she came to do, had risked everything on a folded note and a king's perceptiveness. Now she simply waited to see if courage had been enough. From the kitchen doorway, Balthazar allowed himself the smallest exhale. His subtle sabotage had bought time. The king had understood. And somehow, impossibly, the dishes had been redirected. His family might yet survive this. The final course was announced, a delicate pastry glazed with honey and dusted with gold leaf. Purely ceremonial, meant to symbolize prosperity and the sweetness of renewed oaths. Aurelian consumed it without hesitation. Then he stood, his movement commanding immediate silence. Every eye turned toward him. The ritual was reaching its conclusion. The moment when blood oaths would be formally renewed and binding magic would seal the houses to his rule for another decade. Lucius's hands clenched behind his back. The king was supposed to be dead. This moment, this sacred, carefully orchestrated moment, should have ended in chaos. Instead, Aurelian Nightborn stood tall, alive, and absolutely in control. The vampire king raised his goblet one final time. To loyalty, he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. To tradition. And to those who serve with honor, even in silence. His eyes found Seraphina, then Balthazar, then, finally, devastatingly, Lucius. The court drank. And in that instant, Lucius understood. He hadn't failed. He had been allowed to fail. The king had known from the beginning and had transformed the assassination into something far more dangerous, a test. One that Lucius had just spectacularly failed. Okay, story family, real talk. If you're feeling the tension right now, if your heart is racing wondering whether Aurelian survives this, I need you to do something for me. Smash that like button.
Hit subscribe.
And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in Chicago, hiding under the covers? Dubai, watching during your lunch break? Melbourne up way too late? I want to know, because tomorrow I'm dropping another story that's going to hit just as hard. Now let's see how this vampire king handles betrayal. The feast concluded with the ritual words spoken in a language older than the obsidian court itself. The blood oath shimmered in the air like heat over stone, binding magic settling into the noble houses like chains forged from starlight and obligation. Aurelian remained standing. The court expected him to sit, to signal the formal end of ceremony. Instead, he simply waited, his silence expanding until it filled the hall like gathering pressure before a storm. Lucius Varick, he said finally, his voice carrying no anger, no heat, just the terrible weight of inevitability. Step forward. The steward's face drained of what little color it held. For a fraction of a heartbeat, he considered fleeing. But there was nowhere to run in the obsidian court. Every exit was watched. Every shadow held eyes. So Lucius stepped forward, his centuries of training holding his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral. Your Majesty, you have served this court for 247 years, Aurelian continued, each word measured and precise. You have organized 312 blood oath ceremonies. You have been present at my side through wars, insurrections, and the rise and fall of noble houses. Your loyalty has been, until recently, exemplary. The word hung in the air like a blade. I don't understand, Your Majesty, Lucius said smoothly. If I have given offense. Tonight's feast was poisoned. Aurelian's words cut through the hall like winter wind. Gasps echoed from the noble houses. A compound called Noctis Eternal, prepared under false orders, designed to kill me during the ceremonial meal. An assassination disguised as tradition. Lucius's mind raced, searching for the angle that would save him. Your Majesty, this is outrageous. If there was poison, then someone has. You commissioned it. Aurelian gestured, and a servant came forward bearing a leather portfolio. These are the altered preparation orders, written in your hand. The sigils you modified to conceal the poison. The invoices for ingredients that don't appear in any legitimate recipe. The portfolio was opened. Documents spread across a side table where the entire court could see them. Lucius's handwriting. His signature. His careful planning laid bare like a dissected corpse. Furthermore, Aurelian continued, you placed a blood-binding curse on Chef Balthazar Reed, threatening his entire lineage to ensure compliance. The covenant of ash and bone, a ritual so barbaric it was outlawed 6 centuries ago. Balthazar stood in the kitchen doorway, trembling. Aurelian's gaze found him, and the king's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Balthazar Reed, you are released. Aurelian spoke words in the ancient tongue, syllables that tasted of iron and breaking chains. The air around the chef shimmered, then cracked like invisible glass shattering. Balthazar gasped, his hand flying to his chest where the binding had lived like a second heartbeat. It was gone. Your family is safe, Aurelian said. Your service was coerced. You are pardoned. Tears streaked down Balthazar's face as he dropped to his knees. Lucius tried one more gambit. Your Majesty, if I may explain, the court has stagnated under your eternal rule. I acted not from malice, but from necessity. Change requires. Change requires courage, Aurelian interrupted, his voice dropping to something colder than death. You possessed only cowardice. You hid behind ancient oaths and threatened innocence rather than speaking your grievances openly. You are not a revolutionary, Lucius. You are simply a servant who grew resentful of serving. The king moved down from the high table, crossing the floor until he stood directly before his former steward. They were the same height, but at that moment, Aurelian seemed to tower. I have survived 3 centuries by understanding one principle. Mercy is temporary, but memory is eternal. So, I will not kill you, Lucius Varick. Death would be too quick, too clean, too close to the mercy you clearly don't understand. Aurelian placed his hand on Lucius's shoulder, a gesture that might have looked paternal to anyone who didn't see the absolute terror in the steward's eyes. I strip you of your name. From this moment you are nothing. No title, no history, no lineage. You will serve in the crypts beneath this court, tending to the tombs of those who died with honor, something you will never possess. You will exist in eternal obscurity, forgotten by everyone except yourself. And every night, you will remember that you had centuries of life and chose to waste them on petty resentment. The magic that accompanied the words was visible, dark tendrils that wrapped around Lucius, rewriting something fundamental in his existence. His face went blank, then filled with the dawning horror of understanding what forever truly meant. Guards came forward, not roughly, but inevitably. The being that had been Lucius Varick was led away, already fading from relevance even as he walked. Aurelian turned back to the court. Every noble sat frozen, witnessing not rage, not spectacle, but something far more terrifying. Perfect, calculated justice. Let this be remembered, the vampire king said. Betrayal is not ended with violence, but with consequence. Power is not maintained through fear, but through awareness. And this court, my court, will never again mistake silence for consent or service for weakness. He let the words settle, then spoke softer. You are dismissed. The noble houses rose as one. And then, without prompting, without command, they knelt. All of them. Lady Morgan, who had coveted power. Lord Cale, who had hungered for the throne. Baroness Vesper, whose house had once ruled before Aurelian's rise. They knelt not because they feared him, though they did. They knelt because they understood. The king who could orchestrate this level of control while appearing vulnerable was far more dangerous than any tyrant who ruled through obvious force. Aurelian let them kneel for exactly 7 seconds, long enough to be meaningful, short enough to not be cruel. Rise, he said, and remember this night. They rose. They would remember. In the shadows, Seraphina Crow stood perfectly still, her heart pounding, waiting to learn whether her courage had saved her or condemned her. The vampire king's eyes found hers across the hall, and he smiled. Seraphina Crow. Her name, spoken in the vampire king's voice, echoed through the obsidian court like a bell tolling. Every head turned toward the shadows where she stood, suddenly and terrifyingly visible. Her legs felt like water, but she forced them to move. One step, then another, crossing the polished floor that reflected stained glass and candlelight like a pool of frozen fire. The noble houses watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. A servant, summoned before the throne after an assassination attempt had been revealed. They expected punishment.
So, did she?
Seraphina stopped at the prescribed distance, 10 paces from the high table, close enough to hear, far enough to show deference. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands clasped, her breathing shallow and controlled. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she had made her choice 3 nights ago when she wrote the note. There was no running from consequence. Look at me, Aurelian said, his voice softer now but no less commanding. She raised her eyes, met his gaze. His expression was unreadable, ancient and careful as carved stone. You passed me a note tonight, he continued. 7 words that prevented my assassination. Do you deny this? No, Your Majesty. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Why? The question hung in the air. The court waited, breathless. Even the nobles, who moments ago had been contemplating their own survival, leaned forward with interest. Serafina could have lied, could have claimed loyalty, devotion, fear of chaos. But she had already risked everything. There was no point in dishonesty now. Because doing nothing would have made me complicit, she said quietly. And I've already watched one family destroyed by silence. I couldn't, her voice caught. I wouldn't let it happen again. Something shifted in Aurelian's expression. Not quite softness, but recognition. He studied her for a long moment, and Serafina felt the weight of 3 centuries of experience in that gaze. All the betrayals he had survived, all the loyalty he had lost, all the reasons he should trust no one. Then the vampire king did something that had not happened in the Obsidian Court's 300-year history. He stepped down from the high table, crossed the space between them, and knelt. The court gasped. Several nobles half rose from their seats in shock. A king did not kneel. Not to servants, not to equals, not to anyone. But Aurelian knelt before Serafina Crow, his eyes level with hers, his expression grave and deliberate. "You saved my life," he said, loud enough for every vampire in the hall to hear. "Not because you served me, not because you feared me, but because you understood something this court had forgotten. Power means nothing without conscience." He reached into his coat and withdrew a pendant, a silver raven with obsidian eyes, the symbol of the court's founding. It was not a decoration. It was an office. "I name you the King's Watcher," Aurelian announced, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and binding magic. "You will move through this court as you have always moved, unseen, unnoticed, beneath the awareness of those who believe themselves untouchable. But you will no longer be merely invisible. You will be my eyes and ears in places where a crown cannot reach. You will listen where rulers cannot. And you will speak truth to power, even when that truth is unwelcome." He placed the pendant in her trembling hands. "This is not a reward," he continued. "It is a burden. You will be hated by some, feared by others, and trusted by few. But you will be protected by royal decree and bound by no oath except to honesty itself." Serafina stared at the pendant, its weight both literal and metaphorical. She thought of her father, who had died asking questions, of her mother, who had withered from grief, of every servant who had been invisible and expendable. This was not an elevation to nobility. It was something else entirely, a position outside the traditional hierarchy, defined by moral authority rather than blood or title. "Do you accept?" Aurelian asked. She could refuse, could return to invisibility, to safety, to the margins where servants belonged. But she had stopped being that person the moment she folded the note. "I accept, Your Majesty." She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "On one condition." The court inhaled sharply. No one made conditions with the vampire king. Aurelian's lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Speak. If I am to tell you the truth, you must promise to hear it, even when it's about you, even when it challenges your rule. Otherwise, I'm just another voice telling you what you want to hear." For 3 heartbeats, the hall was utterly silent. Then Aurelian laughed, not mockery, but genuine amusement touched with something like respect. "Agreed." He rose, offering his hand to help her stand. "The Obsidian Court has been many things, powerful, ancient, unassailable. But it has never been honest. You will change that." Serafina stood, the pendant now hanging around her neck. She turned to face the court, no longer a shadow, but a presence. The nobles stared at her with expressions ranging from outrage to calculation. They understood what had just happened. Power had shifted. Not dramatically, not through conquest or bloodshed, but through a simple recognition. The smallest voice in the room had become the most dangerous. Because truth, once given a platform, was more cunning than any blade. "The King's Watcher will attend all future court proceedings," Aurelian announced. Her word carries the weight of royal decree. To lie in her presence is to lie to the crown itself. He returned to his throne, the movement signaling the formal end of the evening's revelations. "You are dismissed," he said to the court. Then, to Serafina softer, "Stay." The nobles filed out, their whispered conversations already spinning tonight's events into legend and strategy. Balthazar retreated to his kitchens, free and shaken. The servants disappeared into their routines, though every one of them cast glances at Serafina as they passed. Finally, only Serafina and Aurelian remained in the great hall. "You're wondering why I chose you," he said, not bothering to phrase it as a question. "Yes, Your Majesty. Because you did something I have not seen in 3 centuries. You acted without expectation of reward. You risked everything for principle alone." He paused. "And, because you were right, I have ruled too long from the throne. It's time I learned to see my kingdom from the shadows." Serafina nodded slowly, understanding settling over her like the weight of the pendant. She had entered this hall as a waitress, invisible and expendable. She was leaving it as something that had no precedent, a conscience given authority, a witness given power. The Obsidian Court would never look the same to her again. 3 months after the poison feast, the Obsidian Court looked the same. The black stone columns still rose like petrified trees. Stained glass still cast blood-colored light across marble floors. The rituals continued with their ancient precision, unchanged in form. But everything beneath the surface had transformed. Aurelian stood at the window of his private chamber, watching moonlight paint the courtyard in shades of silver and shadow. He had ruled for 3 centuries, and in all that time, he had believed vigilance meant watching for external threats, armies at the gates, rival houses plotting, magical wards being tested. He had been looking in the wrong direction. The greatest danger had worn the face of loyalty, moved through his halls with practiced efficiency, and struck from within the very machinery he had built. Lucius's betrayal had taught him a lesson he should have learned lifetimes ago. Immortality without humility was just slow-motion blindness. Below, he could see Serafina crossing the courtyard. She wore different clothes now, not noble finery, but something between servant and authority. A uniform of her own design. Practical, unadorned, marked only by the silver raven pendant that caught moonlight as she moved. She was headed toward the eastern wing, where Lady Morrigan held court. The nobles had learned quickly that the king's watcher was not a symbolic position. Serafina attended their gatherings, listened to their conversations, and reported discrepancies between public oaths and private ambitions. She didn't punish or threaten. She simply observed and spoke the truth. It was more terrifying than any inquisitor could be. The noble houses had adjusted, some with grace, others with barely concealed resentment. But all of them had learned the new reality. The Obsidian Court no longer operated in convenient shadows. There was always someone listening, always someone who would speak. In the kitchens, Balthazar Reed had transformed his domain into something that felt less like servitude and more like sanctuary. The blood bindings removal had given him more than freedom, it had given him purpose. He trained his staff differently now, teaching them that cooking was not merely following orders, but an act of creation that carried moral weight. "We feed the court," he told them on their first morning. "That means we hold lives in our hands. Never forget that. Never let anyone make you forget it." The kitchens became a place where servants spoke openly, where concerns were heard rather than dismissed, where the youngest apprentice could question a recipe without fear. Word spread. Other departments began to shift, slowly, carefully, following the example set by copper pots and cutting boards. Change was not dramatic. It was persistent. Serafina's influence rippled outward in ways even she hadn't anticipated. Servants stood straighter, asked questions, reported irregularities they would have once ignored. The invisible infrastructure of the court, the people who cleaned, cooked, served, and maintained, began to understand their position differently. They were not merely furniture. They were witnesses. And witnessing, they learned, carried power. The noble houses grumbled. Of course. Lord Kale complained that the new atmosphere stifled necessary discretion. Baroness Vesper argued that servants needed firm hierarchy, not philosophical empowerment. Lady Morgan suggested, with thinly veiled contempt, that the king's watcher was undermining centuries of tradition. Aurelian heard their complaints with the same patient attention he gave everything. Then he reminded them of the night Lucius Varick was stripped of his name. The complaint stopped. Tonight was another feast, smaller, less ceremonial, but still bound by ritual. Aurelian took his seat at the high table, watching as Balthazar's staff brought forward the evening's courses. The chef himself supervised, his movements carrying confidence that hadn't existed 3 months ago. Seraphina stood in her designated position, no longer in the shadows, but at the edge of visibility, a constant reminder that observation was not weakness, but strength. The first course was placed before Aurelian, a delicate preparation of venison and herbs, garnished with edible flowers that bloomed only in moonlight. Beautiful, symbolic, harmless. The court waited for him to take the first bite, as protocol demanded. Aurelian looked at the dish. Then he looked at Balthazar, who met his gaze with steady assurance. He glanced at Seraphina, who gave the smallest nod, not approval, but acknowledgement. Everything is as it should be. He lifted his fork and paused, not from suspicion, not from fear, but from recognition of what this moment represented. The pause itself was the point, a reminder, built into ritual, that trust was earned rather than assumed. That vigilance was not paranoia, but wisdom. That even a king who had ruled for 300 years should never become so comfortable that he forgot to question. He took the bite. The court relaxed. The feast continued. But the pause remained, woven now into the fabric of how the Obsidian court operated. A breath of hesitation. A moment of awareness. An acknowledgement that power without reflection was just tyranny dressed in ceremony. Later, when the nobles had departed and the servants had cleared the hall, Aurelian found himself alone with Seraphina in the vast space that still smelled of wine and candle wax. "You changed something tonight," she observed. The pause. "I learned it from a note," Aurelian said quietly. 7 words that stopped everything. That made me question what I thought was certain. He looked at her, this woman who had been invisible and was now indispensable. Empires don't fall to armies, Seraphina. They fall to complacency, to the belief that power means safety. And now this empire listens. He gestured to the empty hall, to the space where servants had once moved like ghosts. It doesn't make us weaker. It makes us aware. And awareness, I'm learning, is the only real defense against entropy. Seraphina nodded slowly. My father used to say that history is written by those who survive, but truth is carried by those who witness. Your father was right. Aurelian's expression softened. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. But perhaps, he paused, choosing words carefully. Perhaps his death was not meaningless if his daughter became the voice he never got to be. She didn't cry. She had spent too many years learning not to. But something in her chest loosened, a grief acknowledged if not resolved. The court will never be perfect, Aurelian continued. We are, all of us, too old and too flawed for perfection. But we can be better, conscious, accountable. He smiled faintly. We can be an empire that listens to its own whispers. 300 years, and he was finally learning the lesson that should have been obvious from the beginning. Immortality meant nothing if you were deaf to the truth happening around you. The Obsidian court would endure. The noble houses would scheme. Rituals would continue their ancient progressions. But now, in the margins and shadows, in kitchens and corridors, in places where power forgot to look, there were people watching, listening, bearing witness. And sometimes, when necessary, they would fold the truth into 7 words and pass it across a table. Because that's how empires survived. Not through invincibility, but through the courage of those willing to speak when silence was safer. The smallest voices, Aurelian had learned, often carried the most crucial warnings. And a king wise enough to listen, to truly listen, might rule not just forever, but well. And that's how a waitress saved a king, and a king learned to listen. If this story moved you, if Seraphina's courage or Aurelian's transformation meant something, Do me a favor right now. Subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Drop a like if you felt something real here. And comment below. Where are you watching from? Paris? Lagos? Miami? Vancouver? I'm building a community of people who love stories that dig deep, and I want you to be part of it. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that even the smallest voice can change everything. See you tomorrow, story family. Until then, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, truth whispered is sometimes louder than lies shouted.